Thanks and welcome to the Family Firm post-election conference call. I was recalling today that following the 2016 election, we had this discussion in person at a Bethesda location. And I'm going to venture to say that we'll be able to resume that tradition in 2024. I wish it would be sooner, but we'll shoot for that and maybe a congressional election along the way. The thought I had in thinking over the election results is kind of an analogy between this election and a contentious negotiation. As in a difficult negotiation, the political parties entered with vast differences that seemed irreconcilable. When independent people review any negotiation, the standard way of evaluation is to assess first, was any agreement reached? And secondly, not that each side left happy, because that almost never happens, but rather, did each side leave unhappy? That's kind of the key of a successful negotiation. And basically, that's where the 2020 election results left everyone. Unhappy, but with a resolution. Now, saying that, in the discussion to follow, I'll be assuming that the likely scenario does play out, that the current occupant of the White House leaves, either voluntarily or is expelled. President Biden takes the oath in January, and at least one Republican senatorial candidate in Georgia wins, thus leaving the Senate in Republican control. Although unquestionably the election and the aftermath has been grabbing the headlines in recent weeks, it's not been a decisive influence on the financial markets in those same weeks. Rather, it's the extremely encouraging news from the two vaccine developers weighed against the dire current situation that's triggered some very large moves in the markets. But more on this later. Now let me just get back to the election. So I would assert that for investors, the election outcome was quite favorable. In fact, really throughout this entire election year, it's become apparent that voters are economically conservative, and conservative in the meaning that they oppose sweeping changes, and they support generally the economic, regulatory, taxation framework that's resulted in these booming assets in recent years, asset markets in recent years. We actually saw that in the Democratic primary process, and then again on election day itself. So a divided government, which again is where we're headed, does ensure, if I can use that word safely, that radical changes are not in the cards, and that the prospects of legislation being passed that could rattle the markets have diminished. And I'm not trying to editorialize here, but examples of those would be Medicare for all, an overly expansive Green New Deal, or very large tax increases on individuals or corporations. It's even possible that Republicans may go back to their stance of fiscal responsibility that they often adopt in opposition. And of course, there'll be some changes for sure that will be happening. And as we've learned quite clearly, the presidency has accumulated great powers in recent decades, and the executive branch will be able to have significant impacts no matter what happens in Congress or even the courts. I would argue that many of these impacts would likely be positive for investors, and at least as important, probably more importantly, very positive for the long-term economic and physical security of the world. So I think it's reasonable to hope for greater cooperation with allies and a diminishing of pointless trade conflicts. We can reasonably hope for a recognition that global problems require global solutions and international cooperation. Climate change, global health, migration pressures, rapid advancements in technology and biology are all issues that no country can solve on its own. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts or questions on this post-election landscape. But for now, I'd just like to get back to talk about the vaccine and what's happening with that. So with the news over the past 2 weeks that 2 of the mRNA vaccines appear to be effective and safe, we can finally envision the end of the pandemic and at least attempt to assess what the end game will look like. And it's not to diminish what we'll endure over these upcoming months, which unfortunately is looking rather grim at the moment. States, in the complete absence of federal leadership, continue to experiment with off and on lockdowns and mandates. But it's become clear that the population has no stomach for lockdown measures that would put the economy back into a coma. Biden and his people have already made it clear that these sorts of draconian measures won't happen. And so with this, we can actually begin to get a little sense of what the upcoming months will look like, and even some insights beyond. One thing we can be sure of is that markets will be looking ahead, not backwards, and not even what is happening today. So where might we be headed? And I'd have to assess at least the economic prospects as rather bright at this moment. Again, talking about the time when the pandemic has receded and we're in what will undoubtedly be called the new normal again. So I'd expect some economically dependent investments such as the banks, retail, small cap companies and the like to fare relatively well. Another example would be emerging markets, which will also benefit from more coordinated global cooperation. Now, an area of concern under this sort of scenario of speedier economic growth would be bonds. We'll continue to manage our bond portfolios conservatively. That certainly makes sense in today's low interest rate world anyway. And even though inflation is still unlikely, the probability of price increases has risen and is certainly something that warrants careful consideration. Talking about the markets, we must talk about the technology companies that have come to dominate the major stock indexes in an unprecedented way. Again, I know people are probably tired of hearing me talk about this, but 5 companies, 26% of the S&P 500. Never had anything like this in our history. So I'd have to say that when you're thinking about those companies and their stock prices, there does not appear to be any sort of will among the populace or in Washington to really seriously address the monopolization issue. And thus, I think it's safe to assume these firms will continue to do well. Just the concern from the investor standpoint is that the stock prices for these firms remain extremely high and do represent unrealistic expectations. So at the firm, I think we're going to continue to remain in a defensive posture toward those firms for right now. And lastly, I do think the markets have given us a glimpse of what will be in favor in the post-pandemic world. Over the past week or two, stocks that have surged are things like cruise lines, railroads, Boeing, Disney, while stocks that have fallen, even in what's been a pretty good market over the past couple of weeks, would include the kind of stay-at-home stocks that have gone crazy, really. Peloton, UPS, Home Depot, they're not as speculative, but they've really fared well in the stay-at-home economy. No one knows, of course, how things will look as the pandemic fades. Will everyone resume their lives like it was 2019 or continue like it's been in 2020? Obviously, we're going to end up somewhere between those extremes, and it's that behavioral evolution that will ultimately determine the differentiation between the market winners and the runners up. So with that, I really love to hear any thoughts or questions you have, whether it's about the election or about the economy. I know there's some very biologically savvy people, I'm sure, on the call. So if they have anything to contribute, that would be wonderful too. But anyway, Steve, if you're ready to unmute and allow people to.
Sure. So if anyone has a question, they'd like to unmute themselves. If you're using the Zoom app, you can touch the microphone icon at the lower left, or if you're calling in using your cell phone, you can press *6 to unmute yourself.
So Nate, I have a question.
I'm here.
Are we okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So it's Linda. I know that they keep saying divided government is a positive. But truthfully, as I watch all of these businesses around me locally going out of business because they're not getting any help, I don't see divided government. It may be okay for the stock market, but it doesn't seem very positive for the people who are losing jobs. And I have seen a plethora of those in the last 2 or 3 days. Notices of where we used to park at BWI going out of business. A local wine harvest shop that does sandwiches, you know, places that people are really have always used, and they can't hang on anymore. And the government is not providing any resources for them. I can't help but feel that cumulatively, that is not going to have a really negative impact. So I don't know. I understand that one's a political observation and one deals with the stock market, but the stock market is not all of the economy.
Yeah.
And eventually, I think that has the potential to catch up. So,
Mhm.
know if you want to address that.
Yeah, we'll try. Well, kind of my two thoughts on that are, one, we did have a divided government this spring, right, with the House and Democratic hands, and yet a very significant bill was passed by acclamation almost. And that, so it did, for once, for 5 minutes, they put away their knives and worked something out. I would say it's not, just because it's divided right now, that doesn't mean that there won't be any legislation or any kind of actions taken. To me, it's not really clear if, what McConnell is going to try to strategize. The Senate did propose and has advanced a decent sized package that includes maybe, some things to protect businesses and things like that. So I would say there isn't a total unwillingness to try to find some common ground. And obviously, Biden does have a reputation as someone who's been able to find some people to work with. And at this point, I'm not going to despair about it, because I think honestly, he's uh, surpassed expectations for really almost all of this year. And I think there's reasonable hope that something could be achieved. Will it be what the House passed a few months ago? No, it won't be that. But that might not be the worst thing. If they can actually find some sort of compromise that makes sense. And that is in recognition that the economy has, it's recovered half of what it's lost, but it's not as it was in April and May. It is much better now. So, but great question for sure.
Thank you.
So we haven't talked about this, but I will ask, as far as the vaccines coming through, what do you see that doing? Would you encourage anyone to invest more heavily in any of the medical markets? Has that changed? Do you believe it's made those more stable or ultimately more volatile, or what would you advise?
For which, the healthcare?
In the medical fields, like perhaps, investing in one of these pharmaceutical companies.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any great opportunity for these particular biotech companies or even Pfizer. I mean, it's not even clear how they'll be reimbursed. I would say for the medical field in general, it'll be a great boon, because again, maybe not so much with publicly traded companies, but dentists, just any kind of not elective, but yeah, an elective visit to a physician, which have been so constrained over this year, will, they'll be allowed to, operate again in a normal procedure. Certainly, I imagine the first people up to receive vaccinations will be the healthcare workers, thank goodness. And then they'll be able to actually deal with patients with more confidence, and of course, without dying in droves as they have been. So that would be, extremely positive. It's not really clear if anyone will be profiting off of the vaccines, probably not as much as maybe some people hope for, but just in general, that eventually life will return to some sort of normal, and especially people will be able to visit, ophthalmologists, dentists, all of those sorts of things. They'll be able to, so many of the elective procedures, surgical procedures that have been put off over the past year will be able to, to resume again. And certainly the hospital sector has been battered very severely, and obviously that would be a huge boon for them. So who would have thought that the election would have such a quiet ripple among the folks on the call? But that's fine. I mean, again, not that we can control things from day to day, but it's rarely boring. And I do, just want to, it feels good to have some sense of hope and confidence that, whether it's the spring or summer or for school in 2021, that life will begin to resemble what it was in 2019, and maybe we'll just have learned some great lessons in the meantime, just about public health, and about caring for each other and being responsible citizens.
Nate, this is Rick.
Hi, Rick.
When we talk about global problems requiring global solutions, and you get down to where the rubber meets the road, to use that trite phrase,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if people aren't being a bit optimistic about how rapidly this multi-matrix economic world we live in will be able to stitch itself together. You have momentum in the negative direction now, and it seems to me it would be a while before it can truly look like an economy that we had 4 or 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. I mean, I don't disagree with you at all. But if you think about even just simple things like not dropping out of the World Health Organization in the midst of a pandemic, kind of at least being part of the process to think about some of the issues, again, like climate change, although it doesn't affect the economy on a day-by-day basis, but just having the major players engaged and talking about it and not just ceding the leadership to other countries that may or may not, have everyone's best interest at heart. That's would seem to be a positive step, but it's not. I agree with you. It's not just you shake hands at the G7 and pose for a picture, and then everything starts functioning well again. Because some of. Oh, go ahead, Rick. Sorry.
I'm thinking more on the down at the small business end of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it will be tough without the government support and forbearance again, for sure it will be. And it's, as we were talking about with Linda, it's not clear to what extent that will be extended. My guess, if you'll allow me, would be that something will happen. It will not be, maybe it won't be sending everyone $1,200 again, but there'd be, if we kind of in a situation where we know we just have to get to April or May and some of the pressure will be relieved. I think it's reasonable to hope that there be some support. There is actually I forget all these acronyms, but the CARES Act, I think it was, in the spring, did provide the Federal Reserve with an absolutely breathtaking amount of money they could lend to small businesses or even to local governments that hasn't really been tapped for a variety of bureaucratic reasons and things like that, as apparently the Treasury Department with the Trump administration didn't seem very supportive of it, or they were putting a lot of stipulations to make sure that losses weren't incurred, which is great. Yes, we should be watching out for the public purse. But that bill was enacted to basically enable widespread lending without necessarily such careful regard to credit quality from the Federal Reserve, which, as we've seen, can just print up all the money they want. That reservoir of money has barely been tapped. And if somehow the Treasury can find a way to unlock that legislation has already been passed. So, there could be some, if Congress does continue to completely balk, there could be a way around that could provide more targeted relief towards small business. Because as we talk about the stock market and all that, they've been fine because the Federal Reserve has found that more easy to intervene in those markets, to support asset prices, to, in some cases, actually go into the market and buy bonds. For some reason, they bought Apple bonds themselves. I'm not sure why, but they did, just to send a signal. And that kind of firepower, if it's really turned onto the areas of the economy that are more needy, I do think it can be pretty impactful. And I guess we'll have to see. Hopefully, everything doesn't have to be on hold until January that would be unforgivable, but there's been a few things like that. But if the situation, even if it has to drag into January and they are able to sort of hit the ground running and to unleash some of this financing, that could turn things around pretty quickly, I would think.
Thank you.
Thanks, great question.
Hey Nate, this is Holly.
Hi, Holly.
So you were saying that the divided government, if the Republicans take the Senate, is a good thing?
For investors.
I'm not doing anything. Does that mean that if the Democrats take the Senate, that it wouldn't be good?
I mean, well, for the investing landscape, my personal feeling is that the market would not really like that very much because, in general, I think it prefers measures that are more targeted towards, towards business, towards lower taxation, towards a lighter regulatory touch. And I'm a Democrat, as you know, but I think that the Democratic platform, if it was enacted, would not be very favorable for investors. The amount of spending that was in that, even though I know there are some tax increases in there that would be designated to cover some of the spending, but that level of spending would really put a lot of pressure on interest rates. And when interest rates go up, everything starts to get very shaky. And I think there would be a legitimate fear of that. So I'm just trying to present things, from the atmosphere of the investor. And as I mentioned, what will many of the changes that will be enacted, just even if it's from the executive branch itself, will be extremely favorable for really the world, but also will not disadvantage investors as well.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thanks. Well, if there's no one else, that's of course fine. I think, as probably everyone on the call knows, but we'll send out an email afterwards. Steve does a great job of putting the recording up on the website, and we'll send out the link, to those of you who are here, and of course those who aren't. And we look forward to our next call together. And again, we look forward to eventually meeting with people in person again. It'll be very exciting, and to having these kind of events where we're actually all in the same place together. That'll be whenever it happens, it'll be very welcome. So I wish everyone a great night, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks.
Thanks, Nate.
Bye to
Sure.
all.
Thank you, Nate. Hi, Kate.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Hey.